What is post-journalism? It's an entirely new business model, and it was stumbled on by the New York Times. In 2016, the New York Times had less than 1 million digital subscribers and was struggling. Trump comes. By the end of the Trump administration today, the New York Times has 10 million digital subscribers.
Martin Gurri is a writer, a former media analyst at the CIA, and author of the prescient 2014 book, The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium.
Post-journalism essentially is the idea that journalism commodifies polarization.
In this deep dive interview, he breaks down the radical transformation of our media and information landscape after the internet, in effect, democratized information.
The elite have seen their authority completely hemorrhage away. And they are on the warpath about it. They're trying to create censorship structures. They're giving us reasons why democracy can't survive unless we censor information and communication that the everyday public has access to.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Martin Gurri, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Happy to be here.
Let's talk about post-journalism. I'm very excited actually to have this conversation because we live in a world today where media do not work the way that we thought they did. And you've been looking into this. Andre Mir, who wrote the book Post-Journalism, has been looking into this. Let's dive in.
Okay, I think it's best to go back and say we never really understood what was going on with media. For example, in the old days of newspapers, the newspapers were never sold to the public. No American newspaper ever survived by selling newspapers to the public. They sold airspace or eyeball space to advertisers. Now, when you have advertisers more or less dominating your business model, you can have a special kind of style. That's the old journalistic style that was so kind of remote and abstract, and you will be very much make a case that you are being objective. You're not taking sides, and you take opinion to be this dangerous, volatile substance, and you kind of put it in a little corner of your newspaper. Say, this is opinion over here. You can look at it or not, but the rest is fact. It's reporting. It's straight. It's objective. Well, that model blew up with the internet because all the advertisers went online. So now what is post-journalism? It's an entirely new business model. And it was stumbled on by the New York Times. And the New York Times may be the only one who can be successful, because I'm not sure you can have more than one. But it basically means that you are now a temple of ideology for a specific set of people who believe in that ideology, right? So in this case, obviously, it's very liberal, very progressive people, very anti-Trump people. When I say the New York Times stumbled into this, it was 2016. In 2016, the New York Times had less than 1 million digital subscribers and was struggling. Trump comes. By the end of the Trump administration today, the New York Times has 10 million digital subscribers. They, by trial and error, realized that by posing as the sort of like hand-holding therapy, almost religious, it's a creedal thing, safety garden, where everybody who was terrified by Trump could kind of come trooping into this protected garden and be told the right words, be told, no, he's going to get impeached, don't worry, look at all the horrible things that he did. For example, if you take the Russia story, where he was supposed to have been, basically Vladimir Putin's agent, they published 3,000, at least 3,000 by my estimate, stories on Trump being manipulated by the Russians. Was that correct? Well, in the old journalistic world, it would have been very incorrect, because when the report was made on that particular subject, it was said there was no collusion whatsoever, right? Was it correct from a business model sense? Well, yeah, they got millions and millions of subscribers because of that. So now you have a very different model, and you have a very different tone, and you can call Trump a liar, then the word is used all the time. You can censor certain news. If you talk to Barry Weiss, who lived in the New York Times for a while, she'll tell you she could not get certain stories published because they went against the great story that they're trying to promote. Post-journalism essentially is the idea that journalism commodifies polarization. And so far, the New York Times has done it really well. As I say, there can only be one pope, there can only be one church. I'm not sure that any other newspaper can survive doing that particular trick, but they're doing it pretty well. And by the way, the word is not mine, is my friend Andre Mir, who wrote a book called Post-Journalism, who I would recommend to anybody who's interested in the subject.
Why don't I tell you how I've been describing what has happened? And this is actually from my reading of Andre Mir, which, frankly has changed a lot of my thinking about media. He's really coming from the vantage point, I mean, as you do, that it's actually the nature of how media work has this profound, even a greater influence on how we communicate than the actual topics that are being discussed, right? Or the opinions.
Right. I mean, Andre, he's a McLuhanist. I am somewhat of a McLuhanist.
Maybe just briefly, so Marshall McLuhan, just give us a little thumbnail of what
well, he was a very brilliant, very eccentric writer. He's famous for saying the medium is the message. The medium is the structure, right? You and I tend to, most everybody tends to just bicker over, well, he said this about that, and this is a lie, this is truth. Deal with content. McLuhan dealt with structure, and Andre Mir does the same thing. He believes that the structure of communications, of information, determines a great deal of our behavior simply by being an ecological force, by being transformative of the landscape that we live in. So if you have a television set, you have the whole family gathered there, kind of like passively taking things on. If you have the internet, you're sitting pounding away, going, I like, I dislike, I'm going to yell at this guy. It's very different. The structure is different. Your landscape is different. You're going to be different. It can't help. And you can deal with the little tactical content questions, but what matters is the bigger picture. The structure has been imposed on the landscape.
Well, so I'm going to explain in my very glib way of what I see Andre's argument is, and I'm going to get you to comment on it, okay? Because actually maybe I can learn a bit more and add to my story or fix it, okay? Back in the day, before the printing press, before the Gutenberg press, human beings tended to live in smaller groups. They would share a value system, the whole kind of cosmology, concept of reality. And a lot of as we know through a lot of studies in psychology, a lot of our communication is actually nonverbal, right? Our emoting can be much more important in a way. What we're emoting with the eye contact and everything is maybe has a much bigger influence than even the words that I'm using, and some people would argue.
If you ever talk to somebody who speaks a foreign language you don't understand, that's true because you can communicate.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. 100%. So then, with time, suddenly we get to the Gutenberg Bible. Of course, you get to the written word, and there's a few steps now, and suddenly you can actually mass produce information and send it out, a single message, right? But the written word is much more abstract than this type of communication, right? So it's actually hard. You need, Shakespeare was good at transmitting emotion, and of course there's pamphleteers and propaganda and things like that, but it's actually difficult. Like, you have to be really good at it to transmit that stuff in the written word. But what happens subsequently, right? We get radio, then we get television, we get the internet, we get social media, and then we get AI juiced up social media. Okay, this is a very rapid progression. We have this way of transmitting a single idea or a single video or, to millions of people in many cases. But now we have that ability to emote, that ability to communicate in all these other ways than just the written word. And for people to receive them that don't share that same value system necessarily. And so we basically end up in this situation where we either kind of pick the people that we agree with, and we push away the people that we don't, or the messages, and that's inherently polarizing. And hence, what I think Andre said, that he says that polarization is the software of media today, which when I first read that, I was really kind of stunned. But I think there's truth to that. So okay, here we go. There's my story. What do you think?
Well, what Andre says, of course, is he estimates in some way that I'm not sure I can follow, that there were possibly in the 2,500 years of literacy, there were possibly 300 million people who consider themselves to be authors to an audience, right? 300 million. In the last 40 years, we have 5 billion. Okay, this has just exploded exponentially, the number of people. He calls it the emancipation of authorship, right? Now, when you have 5 billion people in a room, what happens? Well, it's this gigantic noise. It's this gigantic noise. So the thing you need, whereas what you needed in the olden days of top-down communication was enough money to get a printing press, to buy a newspaper, to get a delivery system. If you had that kind of money, you could hire the reporters. You could do it. That's what you need. What you need now is attention. How do you get attention in this enormous, gigantic room with 5 billion people in it, all talking at the same time? Well, number one, you want to talk louder than anybody else. So yelling and screaming is favored by the structure. Number two, if I can get you to start yelling at me, and then people start lining up behind me saying, oh yeah, he's a bad guy, he's one of those guys, and suddenly I'm a leader of my tribe, I get way more attention. So Jonathan Haidt, who's I assume you know, he's a social psychologist who's written some wonderful books. He calls it the Tower of Babel. All right, we're in a strange situation where we're all speaking foreign languages to each other, and I'm yelling at you and you're yelling at me, and we're both gaining from it because our people are lining up behind us. But in fact, I'm not listening to you because I barely understand what you're saying, and it's the same with you. There's no communication, and so polarization is as much a factor of our rhetorical posture. And it's a question I have. It's a question I have, okay, and I don't have the answer, which is, to what extent is internet anger, rage, which everybody talks so much about, real? And to what extent is, back in the day of the Elizabethans, lovers, the gentlemen would write sonnets to their girlfriends, right? Well, I'm pretty sure the sonnets didn't come trippingly out of their mouths. That was just what was expected. If you're a gentleman in Elizabethan England, you're supposed to write a sonnet to your girlfriend. It better be a good one. If you are an opinionator, as all of us are in the Tower of Babel, you better pretend to be angry, whether you are or not. All right. So is it a rhetorical posture? To what extent is it real underneath that? I don't know. It's a question.
Fascinating. Well, because again, the medium
is dictating the rhetoric.
Is dictating the nature of the rhetoric. Well, and this is what keeps me up at night. I think you're right. Right? Is that, is there room for people that don't want to be angry in their communication? Right.
I think, this is an enormous room with 5 billion people. I think there's room for everybody. I think if you want increased attention, follow the New York Times. Start your own little church of progressive elitism and say, this is a protected garden, come to us, and you will go from 1 million to 10 million subscribers in 5 years. Otherwise, there will always be people who, don't want to be yelled at, and I never, to my knowledge, have ever written in an angry or enraged mode. People read what I write. So, yeah, you can do it, but you're swimming upstream.
Martin, we're just going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back. And we're back with author of Revolt of the Public and his blog, Fifth Wave, Martin Gurri. The thing that keeps me up at night, right, since we're talking about this, is I have to believe that there's enough people out there who want to learn new things, who want to be challenged, who want to figure out how to communicate with people that have dramatically different ideas than they do. Because my concern is, right, to me, the logical conclusion of this Tower of Babel setup, where you have, the people that are most effective at kind of let's say, harnessing their particular tribes, we'll just end up fighting each other.
I hesitate because there is such a gigantic air gap between the Tower of Babel, the digital world, and you and I sitting here in this room in the flesh. It's such an air gap. And the people who go and rage online, go feed their cats and take their puppies for a walk and are probably the meekest of the meek, it's hard to tell how those two worlds interact, far more so than it's been with any previous information structure, with a possible exception of the printing press, which was terribly disruptive.
Basically, you're saying in real life, you can be this super nice, compassionate person, but suddenly you're on X or some other place, and you're just a terror.
Well, I mean,
right?
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because you're expected to be. Because the structure is telling you, if you just kind of become this mealy-mouthed, nice guy, nobody's going to listen to you, and nobody talks that way on the web. You brash, loud, scream, rage. So is that really what's happening? If you were on the street confronting what we're seeing like almost staged versions of the online conflicts, for example, between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian groups. So maybe that's the bad future would be that suddenly this becomes real, okay? But honestly, if you look at a lot of the people who have been, for example, I have looked at the protests in Colombia, I wrote about that. I mean, these are a bunch of privileged characters that they say a lot of harsh words about killing Zionists, for example, but
most of them aren't ready to do that.
I think if you drop them in Gaza, they would just basically go into fetal position and hope that somebody would rescue them, because they're not killers. They're not really ideological warriors. They're internet warriors, which is an entirely different thing. And they've taken it enough that in a university environment where that is rewarded, they have been very vocal and in some ways, I think, very vicious about the opposite side.
Media has been democratized, right? And then on the other hand, one of the constructs I've heard it described as is, there's the sort of the vestiges of the traditional media model trying to, basically stop that, the revolt of the public, so to speak, right? But you're making me think about this differently, because you just explained to me how the New York Times, built its business, which is definitely not the old model.
Nope. No. Everything is going to change. Everything's going to, the people, and there's no question in my mind that it's not just media, which was obviously for pretty understandable reasons first to be disrupted by the internet. There was a class of individuals with a following, by the way, that ran the world in the 20th century. I call them elites. You can call them whatever you wish. They basically ran these very important institutions, not just government, but for example, the universities, the media, of course, scientific establishment, business, entertainment. These are people who ran these institutions. And they expected a certain deference and respect and control, particularly. And that got blown away. All the institutions of the 21st century were started in the 20th, which was the heyday of the top-down, I talk, you listen model of organizing humanity. And that model required a semi-monopoly over information to be legitimate, and that got blown away by the internet. So the last 20 years have seen this. Revolt of the Public is, of course, the title of my book, but the subtitle was A Crisis of Authority of the Institution, the crisis of authority in the 21st century. The elite have had seen their authority completely hemorrhage away. And they are on the warpath about it. They are on the warpath about it right now. They're trying to create censorship structures. They're giving us reasons why democracy can't survive unless we censor material, unless we limit the amount of material, information and communication that the everyday public has access to. Because the public, in this view, is very gullible. and can be easily misled by these populists like Donald Trump through means like fake news, for example, and therefore some set of guardians who don't share this weakness of gullibility must be interposed between the origin of the media, of the source, and the public. In other words, they must censor and detoxify the flow of digital information. We are at the present moment in this, very politicized pre-election moment, are confronting an administration that, without ifs or buts, says we need to censor free speech. Things are not like they used to be. Back in the days of the Constitution framers, the information was very different. Things have changed. You need to allow us to censor it so that we can protect the truth, all right? And of course, those of us who come from Cuba have heard this story before. And it's not about truth, it's about control.
Maybe as we finish up, for the typical person that might be watching this show, what's the best way to stay sane in this environment?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure that I've succeeded. But I always say, read books. Read books. Everybody says, well, what if they do this? The newspaper's going away. How will people know? Okay, read books. It's fine to read articles. I write them. Please read them. But there is such a surfeit of people basically opinionating and explaining and lying, and that if you dive too deeply into it, you may lose your mind. All right. So do what I said before, which is do the perspective. But the only way you can do this by go read the books and go in depth. Don't read something that's half an inch deep. Read something that gets you to the bottom of things. Read Andre's books, for example. I mean, that will get you halfway there, okay? Read books, and not necessarily books you agree with, but a book gives you enough data and enough argumentation that you can interact with it and learn whether you are going too much in one direction or not, or whether you're just right and this is an interesting perspective, but you can see the falsehood in it. Read books. Read books.
Well, Martin Gurri, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
I've enjoyed this a lot. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
I look forward to that.
Yep.
Thank you all for joining Martin Gurri and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.